Welcome to History for Nap Time. Tonight, we travel back more than 2,000 years to meet a queen whose name has echoed across history, Cleopatra VII of Egypt. She is remembered as a woman of extraordinary beauty, a cunning politician, and a figure who captivated two of Rome's greatest men, Julius Caesar and Mark Antony. But how much of her story is fact, and how much is legend? Was Cleopatra truly the most beautiful woman in history, or was her allure something more, a fusion of intelligence, charisma, and careful self-presentation? In this episode, we'll explore how Cleopatra used her beauty, her mind, and her presence to shape history. And along the way, we'll look at her relationships, her rituals, and the myths that grew after her death. To understand Cleopatra, we need to understand the world she was born into. Cleopatra VII was born in 69 BC in Alexandria, the shining jewel of Egypt, founded by Alexander the Great. Her family, the Ptolemies, were Macedonian Greeks who had ruled Egypt for centuries. They built a dynasty that blended Greek and Egyptian traditions, and they ruled from the magnificent city of Alexandria, with its great library, its bustling harbor, and its famous lighthouse, one of the wonders of the ancient world. The Ptolemaic dynasty was known for intrigue, rivalries, and ruthless ambition. Brothers and sisters married, plotted, and sometimes murdered one another for the throne. Cleopatra grew up in this environment of luxury and danger. By the time she came of age, Egypt was a wealthy but fragile kingdom. Rome loomed as a growing superpower, and the Nile's riches were too tempting for Roman generals to ignore. For Cleopatra, survival meant not just ruling Egypt, but also managing Rome. It was in this high-stakes world that her beauty, her wit, and her political skill became her greatest weapons. Cleopatra became queen at just 18 years old, sharing power with her younger brother Ptolemy XIII. It was a troubled arrangement, and soon her brother's advisors forced her into exile. But Cleopatra was not one to accept defeat. She planned her return, and when Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria in 48 BC, she saw her chance. Here we come to one of the most famous stories of history, Cleopatra's dramatic entrance. According to legend, she had herself rolled inside a carpet, or possibly a linen sack, and smuggled into Caesar's quarters. When the bundle was unrolled, the young queen appeared before him, not as a defeated exile, but as a dazzling, confident monarch. This story, whether fully true or exaggerated by later writers, captures something essential about Cleopatra. She understood the power of drama, spectacle, and presence. Her beauty was not just physical. It was a performance, a carefully staged moment that would never be forgotten. Ancient sources often describe Cleopatra's beauty, but when we read carefully, we notice something important. They rarely say she was the most physically beautiful woman. Instead, they speak of her charm, her voice, her intellect. Plutarch, a Greek historian writing a century later, put it clearly. Her actual beauty, it is said, was not in itself so remarkable, but the contact of her presence, if you lived with her, was irresistible. The attraction of her person, joined with the charm of her conversation and the character that attended all she said or did, was something bewitching. This tells us that Cleopatra's true allure was not in appearance alone. It was in how she carried herself, how she spoke, how she made others feel. Still, Cleopatra did cultivate beauty in practical ways. Ancient legends tell us she bathed in donkey's milk to keep her skin soft and radiant. She used kohl eyeliner, not just for aesthetics, but also to protect her eyes from the Egyptian sun. Her lips were colored with red pigments, and her hands were perfumed with fragrant oils. Perfume was especially important. Egypt was famous for its perfumes, and Cleopatra controlled the production. She experimented with unique blends, and some stories even say she created her own signature scent. When she met Mark Antony, her ship's sails were soaked in perfume, so the air carried her presence before she arrived. This wasn't vanity, it was politics. Cleopatra understood that beauty was not only about appearance, but about creating an atmosphere of memory and desire. People remembered her not only for what they saw, but for what they smelled, heard, and felt. Cleopatra's alliance with Caesar was one of the most decisive moments of her life. When Caesar arrived in Egypt, he was already the most powerful man in Rome. By aligning herself with him, Cleopatra secured her throne, defeated her rivals, and began her journey into legend. Their relationship was not merely romantic, it was deeply political. Cleopatra offered Caesar wealth, grain from the Nile, and a powerful ally in the east. Caesar gave her military backing and legitimacy. Together they had a son, Caesarion, the only known child of Caesar. For Cleopatra, this child represented the union of Egyptian royalty and Roman power. When Cleopatra visited Rome, she shocked the city by appearing openly as Caesar's partner. For the conservative Romans, it was scandalous. For Cleopatra, it was a statement. She was not a mistress, but a queen. Her beauty and charisma were part of this success. But what truly impressed Caesar, and others, was her boldness, her intelligence, and her ability to play the game of politics as an equal. After Caesar's assassination, Cleopatra needed another Roman ally. She found one in Mark Antony. Their first meeting has become the stuff of legend. Antony summoned Cleopatra to explain her role in the politics of the East. She responded not with fear, but with theater. She sailed up the river on a golden barge, with purple sails, dressed as the goddess Aphrodite. Musicians played, incense filled the air, and Cleopatra lay under a canopy, radiant and untouchable. Antony, known for his love of luxury, was enchanted. Their partnership began with spectacle, but it grew into a true alliance of power and, by all accounts, passion. They lived lavishly, hosting extravagant feasts. Cleopatra wagered that she could host the most expensive dinner in history. To prove it, she dissolved a priceless pearl in vinegar and drank it, astonishing Antony and everyone present. Again, beauty here was not passive. It was active, theatrical, and tied to authority. Cleopatra projected herself as both lover and goddess, binding Antony to her politically as well as emotionally. To the Romans, Cleopatra became a dangerous symbol. Octavian, Caesar's heir and Antony's rival, spread propaganda portraying Cleopatra as a temptress who had bewitched Antony and threatened to corrupt Rome. She was painted as a foreign sorceress, a seductress who used her beauty to weaken men. This image stuck for centuries. Plays, poems, and later films would repeat it. Cleopatra as the exotic femme fatale. But behind this smear campaign was fear. Cleopatra represented an independent Egypt, rich, powerful, and unwilling to bow to Rome. Her beauty became the weapon Octavian used against her, an excuse to justify conquest. The story of Cleopatra's death is as famous as her life. After Antony was defeated at the Battle of Actium, he and Cleopatra retreated to Egypt. When Octavian's forces closed in, Antony fell on his sword. Cleopatra, left with no escape, chose to die on her own terms. The most famous version says she allowed a venomous snake, an asp, to bite her. Some suggest she used poison hidden in a comb or ointment. However it happened, her death was a final act of control. She refused to be paraded in Rome as a trophy. She chose dignity, drama, and myth. In dying as she did, Cleopatra ensured her legend would outlive her kingdom. Cleopatra's beauty has been exaggerated and romanticized for centuries. Painters and filmmakers have imagined her as the most stunning woman who ever lived. But ancient evidence suggests something different, that her power lay less in physical appearance and more in personality. She spoke many languages, could debate philosophy, negotiate politics, and command attention. She understood how to use spectacle and performance. She knew how to turn beauty into a political tool. The Cleopatra we remember is part reality, part myth. But in either form, she remains
Cleopatra,
unforgettable.
the
seventh of Egypt, was more than just a beautiful queen. She was a ruler who fought to keep her kingdom alive in the shadow of Rome. Her beauty was part of her power, but it was her intelligence, charisma, and courage that truly made her remarkable. She captivated Julius Caesar. She enchanted Mark Antony. She terrified Octavian. And she left behind a story that has fascinated the world for 2,000 years. This has been History for Nap Time. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the past. May the echoes of Cleopatra's story stay with you as you drift into calm reflection. Welcome to History for Nap Time. Today, we'll be traveling back over 2,000 years into the world of ancient Greece, a society that gave us philosophers, poets, mathematicians, and also some of the first organized fitness training systems in human history. The Greeks believed that training the body was just as important as training the mind. In this episode, we'll explore how they exercised, what equipment they used, where they trained, and why fitness played such a central role in their lives. So sit back, relax, and let's slowly wander through the gymnasiums, arenas, and fields of ancient Greece. The Greeks had a word, arete, meaning excellence. Excellence wasn't only about being clever or brave. It also meant having a body that was strong, balanced, and beautiful. For them, the human body was almost sacred. If you've seen Greek statues, perfectly carved muscles, calm expressions, you've seen their vision of the ideal form. They believed physical training made a person more disciplined, more capable in war, and more attractive to the gods. From childhood, boys were taught that a sound mind lived best in a sound body. This belief set the foundation for all of their workouts. When we hear the word gymnasium today, we think of treadmills, rows of weights, and machines with pulleys and cables. But in ancient Greece, the gymnasium was something far grander and far more central to daily life. The very word gymnasium comes from the Greek gymnos, meaning naked. And indeed, the athletes of ancient Greece trained without clothing, seeing it as a sign of respect for the human body and as a way of honoring the gods who had granted them strength and beauty. For the Greeks, nudity was not shameful. It was natural, even noble. A gymnasium was not simply a room or a hall. It was a sprawling, open-air complex. Imagine wide, sandy courtyards, surrounded by marble columns, with olive trees planted in neat rows to offer shade. At one end, a running track. At another, areas for wrestling or discus practice. And in the shaded colonnades, men gathered to talk. This is where Greek culture shows its unique balance. The gymnasium was both a training ground for the body and a meeting place for the mind. Famous philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle all spent time in gymnasiums, discussing ideas while athletes trained nearby. In fact, Plato's very name comes from his broad shoulders. His nickname, Platon, meant wide. So while one group of men ran laps in the sun, others debated ethics and politics in the shade. Young boys were instructed not only in athletics, but in poetry, music, and philosophy. To be educated in Greece was to train both sides of yourself, body and mind. The gymnasium was also deeply social. It was a place where citizens of a city-state gathered, forming bonds that were as important as the muscles they developed. Aristocrats, soldiers, and ordinary men shared the same sand, the same coaches, the same olive oil to prepare their skin. If you stood in a gymnasium in Athens around 400 BC, you would see a world alive with activity. Wrestlers practicing holds, runners jogging laps, men playing ball games, and in the corner, a philosopher surrounded by eager students, all listening intently as the smell of olive oil and dust filled the air. The gymnasium was a true symbol of the Greek ideal, harmony between body, intellect, and community. Before beginning their exercises, Greeks warmed up carefully. They would rub their bodies with olive oil to protect the skin, then dust themselves lightly with sand to improve grip and prevent slipping. A typical warm-up included stretching, gentle running, and light movements with weights called halteres, small stone or metal dumbbells. This prepared the muscles for more serious training ahead. Running was at the heart of Greek training. The earliest Olympic event, in 776 BC, was simply a sprint down the length of the stadium. They had several types of races. The stadion, a short sprint, the dialos, twice as long, and the dolichos, a long-distance endurance run. Training for these involved repeated sprints, steady jogging, and interval-style exercises. Running wasn't just about speed. It built stamina for soldiers and grace for athletes. Imagine dozens of young men running barefoot on sand tracks under the Mediterranean sun. Among all the exercises practiced in ancient Greece, wrestling, or pale, stood out as one of the most prestigious. To wrestle was to test yourself not only in strength, but in control, endurance, and cunning. Two athletes would face one another on a sandy training ground. There was no ring, no ropes, no mats, just open space and a circle drawn in the dirt. Victory came when one man threw the other to the ground 3 times. There were no weight classes. A small but clever wrestler could outsmart a much larger opponent. Greek wrestling was considered so noble that it was included in the original Olympic Games. Boys practiced it from an early age, learning techniques passed down from teachers called paidotribes. These instructors drilled them in grips, throws, and escapes until the moves became second nature. But wrestling was more than a sport. It was also preparation for war. Greek soldiers, the famous hoplites, fought in close ranks. If their spear or shield was lost, combat became a struggle of grappling and survival. Wrestling trained them to stay calm when grabbed, to use leverage rather than raw power, and to control their breathing in the midst of chaos. Alongside wrestling came 2 other combat sports, boxing and pankration. Boxing was brutal. No padded gloves, just leather straps around the fists. Matches could last for hours, sometimes ending only when one fighter collapsed from exhaustion. Pankration went even further, a mixture of wrestling and boxing with almost no rules. Fighters could punch, kick, grapple, and choke. Only biting and eye gouging were forbidden. To win in pankration was to show absolute mastery over another man. The stories of legendary fighters filled Greek culture. One of the most famous was Milo of Croton, a wrestler who became almost mythical for his strength. He was said to train by carrying a calf on his shoulders every day. As the calf grew into a bull, Milo grew stronger, until he could carry the full-grown animal himself. Whether fact or exaggeration, the story reflects the Greek admiration for strength earned through discipline and persistence. Training sessions were as much about patience as about power. Wrestlers drilled throws slowly, then at full speed. They learned to fall without injury, to conserve energy, to read an opponent's stance. Coaches taught them that brute force would not always win. Clever technique and composure mattered just as much. If you watched a wrestling match in ancient Olympia, you would not see wild chaos. Instead, you'd see calculated movements, bursts of strength, and athletes who looked almost like statues in motion. The Greeks admired the art of wrestling because it showed control of the body and of the will. To build strength, the Greeks used their own creative tools. They lifted halteres, stone or bronze weights. They practiced jumping while swinging these weights, improving both legs and arms. They carried heavy objects, like shields and stones, to mimic the weight of armor. Some accounts describe athletes doing bodyweight exercises, push-ups, squats, and rope climbing, all without the modern machines we see today. Their goal was practical strength, the kind that could win a contest or keep you alive in war. Not every workout was serious. The Greeks also enjoyed playful games, like a form of field hockey, and ball games that built coordination. These lighter activities balanced out the harder training, just as we might play casual sports today. Training wasn't done alone. The Greeks had instructors called paidotribes, who taught wrestling, running, and exercises. They also had gymnasts, who oversaw the athletes' programs and helped prepare them for competition. These early coaches believed in moderation. Too much training could harm the body, just as much as too little. After a long session of training, athletes in ancient Greece did not simply walk away and return to their homes. Recovery was as important to them as exercise itself. When training was finished, the athletes used a tool called a strigil. This was a curved piece of bronze or iron, shaped a little like a small sickle. Covered in olive oil and dust from the training ground, their skin would be sticky and hot. The strigil scraped away the mixture, cleaning the body while stimulating circulation. It was not only practical, it was refreshing. Bathing followed. Some gymnasiums had small pools, others used clay jars of water. Cold baths were especially common, believed to harden the body and prevent fatigue. For wealthier athletes or those in larger cities, communal bathhouses became a place of relaxation and conversation, much like the gymnasium itself. Food also played a key role. A Greek athlete's diet was simple but nourishing. Bread, barley porridge, olives, cheese, figs, and fish formed the staples. Meat was not as common as today, but for Olympic champions, richer diets were sometimes adopted, including beef or goat to build strength. Wine was consumed, but carefully. The Greeks always diluted it with water. Drinking undiluted wine was seen as barbaric. Moderation was the rule, in food and in drink. Philosophers even wrote about diet and exercise. The physician Hippocrates, often called the father of medicine, spoke about the importance of balance. Too much exercise could exhaust the body, just as too much food could weigh it down. But taken together, exercise, diet, and rest produced harmony. Sleep was valued as the ultimate recovery. Athletes needed to be well rested to train again the next day. In Greek literature, sleep is often described as a gentle healer, a gift from the gods. To lie down after training, with muscles still warm and the sound of cicadas in the distance, must have been one of life's quiet pleasures in ancient Greece. In this way, recovery was never neglected. The Greeks may not have had modern sports science, but they understood a timeless truth, that strength grows not just in the effort of training, but in the calm that follows. All this training came together in the great athletic festivals, especially the Olympic Games. Competing wasn't only about winning prizes. It was about honor, representing your city, and pleasing the gods. Victorious athletes became celebrities. Statues were built in their likeness. Poets sang their names. But even those who never competed lived in a culture where fitness was a daily part of life. So what can we learn from ancient Greece? That exercise wasn't just about health. It was about community, discipline, and philosophy. For the Greeks, training body and mind went hand in hand. Perhaps that's why, thousands of years later, we're still inspired by their ideals. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the gymnasiums of ancient Greece. This has been History for Nap Time. May your mind feel calmer and your imagination a little stronger after today's story. Welcome to History for Nap Time. Tonight's story is about a man who lived more than 2,000 years ago, a man who dreamed of conquering the world before most people his age had even learned to rule themselves. His name was Alexander. History remembers him as Alexander the Great. But behind that title lies a human story of a restless boy, a soldier who never stopped marching, a dreamer who tried to unite worlds, and a young man who left behind both glory and silence. Close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let's travel back to ancient Macedonia, to the place where greatness began. Long before empires carried his name, Alexander was simply a boy in a small northern kingdom. Macedonia was wild and mountainous, its people fierce, its nights cold. In 356 BCE, under a summer moon, Olympias gave birth to her son and whispered that the gods had chosen him. His father, King Philip II, was a warrior, broad-shouldered, limping from battle, building an army stronger than Greece had ever seen. Alexander grew up watching blades flash in the courtyard and hearing the sound of hooves in the fields. He loved horses, storms, and stories of heroes. When he was still a child, a black stallion was brought to his father, untamable, snorting and striking at anyone who approached. The court laughed when the young prince insisted he could ride it. Alexander noticed what others didn't. The horse was frightened of its shadow. He turned it toward the sun, climbed on, and rode until both boy and horse were one shape against the horizon. The horse was called Bucephalus. They would never part again. When Alexander was 13, his father brought a tutor to the palace, a quiet man with keen eyes and a mind that measured the world, Aristotle. Under the shade of olive trees, he taught the prince about science, medicine, logic, and poetry. He spoke of virtue and balance, of how every choice leaves an echo in the soul. Alexander listened, but could not sit still for long. After lessons, he practiced with the sword, ran through the fields, and dreamed of adventure. He carried with him a copy of Homer's Iliad, the tale of Achilles, the hero who sought everlasting fame. The boy from Macedonia began to wonder if destiny was waiting for him too. Fate arrived sooner than he expected. When Alexander was 20, his father was murdered during a festival. The palace filled with panic. Enemies inside and outside Macedonia saw a chance to strike. But the young prince moved faster than anyone imagined. He silenced rebellion in the north, crossed into Greece, and demanded allegiance from every city-state. When Thebes rose against him, he destroyed it completely, a warning written in smoke. By the time the dust settled, all Greece obeyed him. He had become king not by inheritance alone, but by fire. Now his gaze turned east, toward the greatest empire in the world, Persia. His father had dreamed of conquering it. The son would make that dream his own. In the spring of 334 BCE, Alexander's fleet set sail across the Aegean Sea. Thousands of soldiers stood on deck as the wind filled their sails. Ahead lay the vast Persian Empire, ruled by King Darius III, a realm of palaces, deserts, and cities shining under the eastern sun. Alexander's first battle came at the river Granicus. He led his cavalry straight through the water and into enemy lines. Spears clashed, shields shattered. He fought in the front, his helmet flashing like fire. By nightfall, the Persians were broken. The campaign had begun. Through Anatolia, through mountains and cities, he advanced, never stopping long enough for doubt. At every victory, he built monuments, offered sacrifices, and wrote letters home to his mother. He was only 22. Years later, after a chain of victories, Alexander reached Egypt. The people welcomed him as a liberator, weary of Persian rule. He visited temples along the Nile, where priests crowned him pharaoh, calling him the son of the god Amun. In the cool light of morning, he chose a stretch of coastline where the sea met the river and marked the outline of a city. He named it Alexandria. It would become a center of learning and trade, a city of scrolls, scholars, and sailors, standing for centuries after his death. That night, perhaps, he felt for the first time what it meant not just to conquer, but to create. Beyond Egypt lay Persia's heart. At Issus and Gaugamela, Alexander faced armies far larger than his own. The earth shook under the feet of tens of thousands of men. He watched, calm and deliberate, then rode straight through the chaos, spear aimed at Darius himself. The Persians scattered, the great king fled, and the empire that had once ruled from the Mediterranean to the mountains of India was now Alexander's. In Babylon, he entered the golden halls once reserved for Persian kings. He sat upon their throne, but did not gloat. Instead, he began to wear their robes, learn their customs, and marry among them. He wanted his new empire to be one people, Greek and Eastern, bound together. To many of his men, this was strange. To Alexander, it was destiny. But destiny is never satisfied. He pressed onward, through deserts and mountains, chasing the horizon. In the burning sands of Gedrosia, his army nearly perished from thirst. When a helmet of water was brought to him, he looked at it, smiled faintly, and poured it into the ground so that no man would envy him. In India, the monsoon rains drenched their armor. They fought war elephants and unfamiliar kings beneath thunder and lightning. At the river Hephaestus, his soldiers finally refused to march farther. They wanted to go home. Alexander stood by the river, staring into the mist, silent for a long time. He had reached the edge of the known world. The march back west was slow and filled with sorrow. Many had died. Those who survived carried scars and memories too heavy for words. In Babylon, Alexander planned new conquests, Arabia next, perhaps beyond that another world. But his body was failing. Years of wounds, exhaustion, and fever caught him at last. During a banquet, he grew pale and weak. Within days, he could no longer stand. His generals came to him one by one. They asked who should rule after him. He whispered, barely audible, to the strongest. A few days later, the king who had crossed continents was gone. He was only 32. When news of his death spread, the empire trembled. His generals, the Diadochi, divided his lands like spoils. Wars followed, cities burned. But the cities he had built, Alexandria and many others bearing his name, survived. Greek language and thought spread through the East. Philosophers, artists, and scientists traveled freely, mixing cultures that had once been strangers. This new age, born from conquest, would be called Hellenistic, an age of learning, invention, and art. Alexander's dream lived on, reshaped by those who came after. What then made Alexander truly great? Perhaps it was not his victories, though there were many. Perhaps it was not his empire, which vanished soon after he was gone. It may have been the vision behind it all, to see beyond borders, to imagine a world connected by knowledge, by trade, by shared humanity. He was restless, flawed, and often cruel. Yet, in every decision, good or terrible, burned the same relentless spark, the desire to go farther. He carried the lessons of his teacher Aristotle, the pride of his mother Olympias, and the discipline of his father Philip. He united courage and intellect, dream and action in one brief life. 2,000 years later, his name still stands for ambition and wonder. But behind that name was simply a man, a boy who rode a frightened horse into the sun and never stopped chasing the horizon. And maybe that is what makes him great. Not the lands he conquered, but the light that still follows him long after the march has ended. You can imagine it now. The quiet plains of ancient Macedonia, the whisper of grass where his footsteps once fell. The horse Bucephalus long gone, the palace's dust, but the dream still drifting across time. History forgets many names, but some remain, not because of power, but because they remind us of what the human spirit can reach. Alexander's life was brief, filled with noise and fire. Yet what endures is the calm after it all, the stillness that comes when the world sleeps, and his story becomes just another soft echo under the stars. So rest now. The battles are over. The king is at peace, and the world he once conquered is quiet again. Good night. When you hear the word Vikings, what images come to mind? Maybe it's warriors charging into battle, axes raised, feasting on roasted meat in great halls, drinking horns of mead, and sailing across the seas in dragon-headed ships. The image is powerful, adventurous, fearless, free. But the truth? Daily Viking life was far less glorious. Living in a Viking village meant hardship, struggle, and discomfort that most of us today would find unbearable. Forget glamorous feasts and legendary raids. The reality was smoky houses, harsh winters, hunger, disease, violence, and fear. So tonight, let's step into a Viking village. Let's see what life was really like, and why you would probably hate it. The first thing you'd notice is the weather. Viking lands stretched across modern-day Norway, Denmark, and Sweden, some of the coldest and most unforgiving parts of Europe. Winters were long, icy, and dark, with only a few hours of daylight. Summers were short, just enough to grow crops if the weather allowed. You'd live in a longhouse, a large wooden hall shared with your family, animals, and sometimes neighbors. Sounds cozy? Think again. The roof was thatched, the floor dirt. A single fire pit burned in the center, sending smoke upward. But there was no chimney, so the smoke filled the air, stinging your eyes and lungs. Imagine trying to sleep while your chest tightens with every breath of smoke. Your daily life? Farming, chopping wood, carrying water, feeding animals, men, women, children, everyone worked. Hunger was a constant fear. If crops failed or winter dragged on, you'd survive on dried fish, salty meat, or rock-hard bread. Food was fuel, not pleasure. The lesson here: Viking life wasn't a saga of adventure. It was survival. To be fair, Vikings cared about grooming more than many ancient societies. Archaeologists have found combs, tweezers, razors, signs that they valued cleanliness. But don't be fooled. Hygiene by modern standards was poor. Toilets? None. You'd use waste pits or rivers. Water sources often doubled as dumping grounds, leading to contamination. Drinking water could make you sick, so people often drank weak ale, safer, but hardly refreshing. Baths were rare luxuries. Most villages managed a weekly wash at best. Soap was made from animal fat and ash. Parasites like lice, fleas, and worms were constant companions. Illness was everywhere. Dysentery, fevers, infections, and epidemics could sweep through entire communities. With no antibiotics, even a cut could kill. The average life expectancy hovered around 40 years. Imagine being considered old at an age many of us now call middle-aged. Viking society prized honor. Your reputation was everything. An insult wasn't just words. It could spark a feud lasting generations. Disputes were settled at the Thing, a local assembly. Here, free men debated and voted on punishments. If you were found guilty of theft, adultery, or betrayal, punishments could be brutal: exile, slavery, or death. And exile in Viking lands was often a death sentence. Without the protection of a community, surviving the cold and the wilderness was nearly impossible. Think about the pressure this created. One wrong word, one lost argument, one insult taken too far, and your entire life could collapse. You couldn't afford to be timid, but you also couldn't afford to be reckless. Living in a Viking village meant living under constant social tension. Women in Viking society had more rights than in many ancient cultures. They could own property, inherit wealth, and even divorce. But their daily reality was still exhausting. Women were the backbone of family life. They cooked, wove clothes, managed the household, preserved food for winter, cared for children, and often tended fields while men were away. Imagine doing all this without modern tools, electricity, or medicine. Childbirth was dangerous. Many women didn't survive it. Those who did often lost children to illness before they reached adulthood. Childhood was short. By the age of 10, most children were already working, herding animals, hauling water, or helping in the fields. Life was not equal opportunity adventure. It was relentless labor. Hollywood shows us endless Viking feasts, roasting boars, rivers of mead, overflowing tables. But reality was less glamorous. The Viking diet was heavy on grains, barley, rye, oats. You'd eat thick bread, porridge, and stews of cabbage or root vegetables. Fish was common, especially in coastal villages. Meat? Rare, unless you were wealthy or it was a festival. Yes, there were feasts, after raids or harvests, but daily meals were plain and repetitive. Imagine eating the same porridge every morning, every winter, for months. The feasts you imagine were exceptions, not the rule. Medical knowledge was limited. People relied on herbs, charms, and prayers. Broken bones often healed badly, if at all. Infected wounds meant fever and death. Toothaches were constant, with no dentists to help. Epidemics were deadly. When the plague or smallpox swept through, entire families perished. And in cramped, smoky longhouses, disease spread like wildfire. The average Viking body carried the marks of a hard life. arthritis from endless labor, scars from accidents or fights, teeth worn down by gritty bread. Life was short and rarely painless. Yes, Vikings raided, but raiding was no glorious adventure. It was brutal and dangerous. Picture rowing for days in freezing seas, waves crashing over the ship, clothes soaked, fingers numb, then landing in hostile territory, fighting trained soldiers or desperate villagers. Wounds, death, capture, all were likely. And remember, not everyone raided. Most Vikings were farmers. Only a few young men went on raids, and many never returned. The warrior image was thrilling in sagas, but for most it was terrifying reality. The gods of the Norse pantheon were powerful, but not comforting. Odin demanded sacrifice. Thor brought storms. Loki sowed chaos. Life was guided by omens, superstitions, and rituals. Farmers prayed for good harvests, sailors for safe seas, warriors for victory. But the gods gave no guarantees, and always in the background was fear of Ragnarok, the end of the world, when gods and men alike would perish in fire and chaos. Imagine living with constant fear of divine wrath and cosmic doom. Faith brought meaning, but also fear. Viking villages were not safe havens. Violence lurked everywhere. Slavery was common. Thralls, enslaved people captured in raids, worked the hardest jobs with no rights. They could be bought, sold, or killed at a master's whim. Blood feuds were frequent. A single insult could spiral into generations of revenge. There was no police force, no central authority. Justice was personal, often violent. In a Viking village, you were never far from danger, whether from enemies outside or disputes within. So let's step back. Why would you hate living in a Viking village? You'd live in a smoky, cramped longhouse with little comfort. Winters would be freezing, food scarce, and survival never guaranteed. Hygiene was poor, disease constant, medicine almost non-existent. Social pressure forced you to fight, defend honor, or risk exile. Violence and slavery were part of daily life. And through it all, you'd face the fear of gods, death, and chaos. The Viking world was not glamorous. It was unforgiving, relentless, and often cruel. And yet, the Vikings endured. They braved seas, built ships, carved out farms in harsh lands, and left behind sagas that still inspire us. But make no mistake, you would not enjoy living in their world. The next time you step into a warm house, pour a clean glass of water, or take medicine for a simple illness, remember, these small comforts are luxuries the Vikings could only dream of. Their strength lay in surviving what we today would struggle to bear. And that's why, if you found yourself in a Viking village, you would probably hate it. When you hear the name Epicurus, what comes to mind? For many people, Epicurean means indulgence, fine wine, rich food, endless luxury. To live Epicurean is thought to mean to chase pleasure at any cost. But this is one of the greatest misunderstandings in history. Epicurus did not teach excess. He taught simplicity. He taught that real happiness is not in endless desire, but in needing less. Not in indulgence, but in friendship, peace of mind, and freedom from fear. Tonight, let's step into the quiet garden Epicurus created more than 2,000 years ago. And as we walk through his story, perhaps we can find in it something that helps us today to live lighter, calmer, and happier lives. Epicurus was born in 341 BCE on the island of Samos, a time when Greece was restless. The great philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, had already shaped much of Greek thought, but their philosophies often felt distant, concerned with grand metaphysics, complex theories, and debates about the cosmos. Epicurus saw a different need. He looked around at ordinary people, men and women burdened by fear of the gods, fear of death, endless striving for wealth and power, and he asked, "How can philosophy make life better here and now?" So he created a school not in marble halls, but in a simple house and garden in Athens. The garden, as it became known, welcomed not just elite men, but also women, freed slaves, and outsiders. It was a place where people could live simply, share meals, discuss ideas, and free themselves from unnecessary fears. The lesson here is immediate. Happiness is not about status. Epicurus's philosophy was for everyone, regardless of wealth or birth. In our own lives, too, we don't need privilege or perfection to begin seeking peace. We begin wherever we are. At the heart of Epicurus's teaching was pleasure, but not the way we imagine it. He divided pleasures into two kinds. The first was fleeting pleasure, luxury foods, indulgence, fame, and material goods. These might feel good for a moment, but they never last. They create new cravings, new emptiness, new restlessness. The second kind was lasting pleasure, freedom from fear, freedom from pain, the quiet joy of friendship, the satisfaction of a simple life. This, Epicurus said, is true happiness. Think about your own life. How many times have you bought something, eaten something, or achieved something, only to feel the joy vanish quickly, replaced by a craving for more? Epicurus warned against this cycle. He taught that happiness is not piling on pleasures, but learning to be content with little. Epicurus gave his followers a simple guide to life, called the tetrapharmakos, the four-part cure. It was like a medicine for the soul. Don't fear the gods. The gods, if they exist, are not angry rulers who punish us. They are distant, peaceful beings. We don't need to live in terror of divine wrath. Don't fear death. Death is nothing to us. When we are alive, death has not come. When death comes, we are no longer here. Why fear what we will never feel? What is good is easy to obtain. Bread, water, a safe place to rest, a friend to share it with. These are the essentials, and they are simple. What is terrible is easy to endure. Pain is either brief or, if it lasts, manageable. With perspective and support, suffering can be borne. Think about how this applies today. We fear things we cannot control. We fear death so much that we forget to live. We chase luxuries when water, bread, and a kind word might be enough. Epicurus's cure is not ancient. It's timeless. Epicurus divided desires into three kinds: natural and necessary. Food, water, friendship, rest. Natural but unnecessary. Rich food, fine clothing, entertainment. Vain and empty, wealth, fame, power, luxury. The wise person, he said, focuses only on the first kind, enjoys the second in moderation, and rejects the third entirely. Think about your own desires. How many of them are really necessary? How many only make you restless, always chasing, never satisfied? Epicurus himself often said he could be content with nothing more than bread, water, and a little cheese. Imagine that. The world told him happiness was in palaces and feasts, but he found joy in the simplest meal. This is our lesson too. Reduce empty desires and nurture the simple ones. Epicurus believed friendship was the greatest source of happiness. In the garden, people lived not as rivals, but as companions. They shared meals, conversations, and laughter. Men, women, even freed slaves, all were welcome. Why did he value friendship so highly? Because friends free us from fear. With friends, we are not alone. With friends, we can endure hardship. With friends, joy is doubled. Epicurus even said, "Of all the things which wisdom provides to make life entirely happy, much the greatest is the possession of friendship." In your own life, think about the moments that brought you the most joy. Were they expensive, or were they simple times with people you love? Epicurus would remind us, happiness is shared, not hoarded. Perhaps Epicurus's most radical teaching was about death. He said, "Death is nothing to us." Most people live in fear of death, fearing pain, fearing nothingness, fearing the unknown. But Epicurus reminded us, when we exist, death is not here. When death comes, we no longer exist. There is no suffering, no awareness, nothing to fear. This freed his followers to live without anxiety. If you don't fear death, you don't waste life. You live more fully, more gratefully, more peacefully. Ask yourself, how much of your anxiety comes from fearing things that haven't happened yet? Epicurus's lesson is to stop waiting for the perfect time and to live now. Not everyone admired Epicurus. The Stoics thought him too focused on comfort. Others accused him of indulgence. Later, Christians portrayed him as a symbol of sin and excess. But these were misunderstandings. Epicurus did not preach endless luxury. His students lived quietly, often with very little. They pursued wisdom, friendship, and calm. The lesson is clear. When you live simply, people who chase excess may not understand you. They may even mock you. But happiness is not measured by the opinions of others. What was life like in Epicurus's garden? It was not filled with banquets. It was filled with quiet meals of bread, olives, figs, and water. It was filled with conversations about philosophy, laughter between friends, moments of reflection under the trees. Epicurus once said, "Send me a little pot of cheese, so that when I like, I may fare sumptuously." For him, even a bit of cheese was a luxury. This is a powerful reminder. Joy is not an extravagance, but in appreciating the ordinary. What simple rituals in your life bring peace? A cup of tea, a quiet walk, writing in a notebook. These are your garden moments. Epicurus's school lasted for centuries. His ideas spread through the Roman poet Lucretius, who wrote On the Nature of Things. Later, during the Renaissance, thinkers revived his ideas of freedom from fear, simple living, and the pursuit of peace. Today, we see echoes of Epicurean thought in minimalism, in mindfulness, in movements that teach us to consume less and live more. The world often tries to sell us happiness through products, wealth, and status. Epicurus whispers across the centuries, happiness is already here, in what is simple and natural. So what can Epicurus teach us, here and now? Cut unnecessary desires. Ask yourself often, do I really need this, or do I only want it because others say I should? Spend time with true friends. Prioritize people who bring calm, laughter, and honesty. Free yourself from fear. Remember that death is nothing to us, and stop letting fear of the future steal joy from today. Practice gratitude for small joys, a meal, a laugh, a moment of rest. Try this. Tonight, before bed, reflect on 3 small joys you experienced today. Not grand achievements, but small, simple moments. This practice alone can begin to shift your mind toward Epicurean peace. Epicurus lived over 2,000 years ago. He had no wealth, no empire, no armies, and yet he left behind one of the most powerful legacies of happiness. He taught us that the art of living well is not having more, but needing less. That freedom is not in excess, but in simplicity. That joy is not in indulgence, but in gratitude. So tonight, take joy in something simple. A breath, a smile, a quiet moment. That is enough. This has been History for Nap Time. Thank you for listening. What does it really mean to be disciplined? For many of us, discipline sounds like restriction, saying no to pleasures, working harder, grinding through things we don't want to do. But in truth, self-discipline is not punishment. It is freedom. Freedom from being controlled by impulses, by emotions, by fears. And there is perhaps no better example of this than Marcus Aurelius, the Emperor of Rome, the most powerful man in the world during his time, who spent his nights writing to himself about humility, about anger, about self-control, about being a better human being. Marcus Aurelius is remembered not only as a ruler, but as a philosopher king. His private writings, known today as meditations, were never meant to be read by anyone else. They were reminders to himself on how to live with discipline, clarity, and purpose. And yet, centuries later, those lessons remain some of the most powerful teachings on how to master ourselves. In this story, we'll explore Marcus's life, his struggles, his victories, and the wisdom he left behind, and how we can use it today, in our own lives, to build self-discipline and live with more purpose. Marcus Aurelius was not born into the role of emperor. He was born in 121 CE in Rome, into a family of noble but not ruling background. From a young age, he was described as quiet, thoughtful, and unusually serious for a child. He had tutors in rhetoric, philosophy, and Greek literature, but even then, he was drawn more toward the Stoics, philosophers who taught that the only true good was virtue, and the only true evil was vice. Everything else, wealth, status, pleasure, pain, was indifferent. One of his earliest nicknames was Verissimus, the most truthful, given to him by Emperor Hadrian himself, who saw in the boy a kind of honesty and sincerity that set him apart. The lesson here is simple. Discipline often begins with humility. Before Marcus became emperor, he was a student. He was willing to learn. He surrounded himself with teachers who challenged him to be better. For us, the same is true. Self-discipline begins not with power or control, but with the willingness to learn, to admit ignorance, to let ourselves be shaped. Marcus's path changed dramatically when Emperor Hadrian chose his adoptive son Antoninus Pius to rule after him, but with a condition. Antoninus had to adopt Marcus as his heir. Suddenly, Marcus was destined for power, but instead of drowning in luxury, he doubled down on philosophy. He studied under Stoic teachers like Junius Rusticus, who gave him Epictetus's discourses. Epictetus, a former slave turned philosopher, taught that while we cannot control what happens around us, we can always control how we respond. Marcus absorbed this deeply. In Meditations, he would later write, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." Imagine being in a palace, surrounded by temptations, wealth, and distractions, and yet choosing instead to practice restraint, to listen to philosophers rather than flatterers. The lesson for us: discipline means choosing carefully what you feed your mind. You are always training yourself with the books you read, the voices you listen to, the habits you repeat. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 CE, Marcus Aurelius became emperor. He did not want the position. In fact, he would have preferred to live quietly as a philosopher. But duty came before comfort. As emperor, Marcus shared power with Lucius Verus, a co-ruler. He married Faustina, with whom he would have many children, though tragically most did not survive to adulthood. His reign would be defined by constant struggle, wars in the east, invasions on the northern frontier, and the Antonine Plague that killed millions. Yet in all of this, Marcus never abandoned his philosophy. He ruled with restraint, preferring justice and fairness over cruelty or self-interest. He lived simply, wore plain clothes, and kept his diet modest. For Marcus, self-discipline meant choosing duty over pleasure, responsibility over comfort. And this is a lesson for us. The disciplined life is not about what is easiest, but about what is right. It is about doing what must be done, even when we would rather not. Perhaps the greatest test of Marcus Aurelius's discipline came not in Rome, but on the battlefield. For much of his reign, he was away from the capital, leading armies along the Danube frontier against Germanic tribes. The conditions were brutal: harsh winters, disease, constant danger. Yet Marcus endured. Even in the midst of war, he wrote his meditations, often in a soldier's tent, reminding himself to stay calm, to stay just, to stay disciplined. He reminded himself that death was natural, that pain was bearable, and that anger was weakness. He wrote, "If you are distressed by anything external, the pain is not due to the thing itself, but to your estimate of it. And this you have the power to revoke at any moment. Imagine the most powerful man in the world, sitting by candlelight in a freezing camp, writing not about conquest, but about patience, humility, and endurance." The lesson here is powerful. Discipline is not about avoiding hardship, but about enduring it with dignity. During Marcus's reign, the Antonine Plague swept through the empire, killing millions. It brought economic collapse, fear, and social unrest. Many emperors before him had responded to crisis with scapegoating or cruelty. Marcus responded with calm. He organized aid, supported communities, and wrote to himself about the importance of perspective. You could leave life right now. Let that determine what you do and say and think in times of chaos. Marcus's discipline was not only physical, but emotional. He didn't allow panic to rule him. He focused on what could be done and accepted what could not. For us, this is a lesson in resilience. When life feels chaotic, discipline means focusing on what is within our control, not wasting energy on what is not. One of the most fascinating aspects of Marcus's life is his habit of journaling. The meditations were his personal notebook, never intended for others. They were his way of holding himself accountable, of practicing discipline in thought. Every day, he reminded himself to wake early, to be kind to others, to control anger, to accept hardship. He trained his mind daily, the way an athlete trains the body. He also lived with simplicity. Despite being emperor, he avoided excess, wore simple clothing, and ate modest meals. The lesson: discipline is not built in dramatic moments, but in daily habits. Journaling, reflection, routines. These are the small steps that create strength over time. Marcus struggled with anger. He was surrounded by corruption, betrayal, and incompetence. Yet he constantly reminded himself, anger hurts the one who holds it more than the one who receives it. He wrote, "When you wake up in the morning, tell yourself, the people I deal with today will be meddling, ungrateful, arrogant, dishonest, jealous, and surly. They are like this because they cannot tell good from evil, but I will not be harmed by them. For Marcus, discipline meant not letting emotions rule him. He accepted that others would be difficult, but he could choose his response. And for us, this lesson is crucial. Self-discipline means mastering reactions. We cannot control how others act, but we can always control how we respond. Rome was full of luxury, feasts, gold, entertainment. But Marcus Aurelius chose simplicity. He wrote often about the emptiness of chasing pleasure, reminding himself that desire is endless if you don't learn to say no. He wrote, "Very little is needed to make a happy life. It is all within yourself, in your way of thinking." He avoided extravagance not because he couldn't afford it, but because he knew it weakened discipline. This is our lesson. Discipline means freedom from desire. The more you need, the less control you have. Simplicity is power. One of the most repeated themes in Marcus's writings is death. He reminded himself daily that life is short and that death comes for everyone, emperors and peasants alike. But instead of this being depressing, it was liberating. By remembering death, he was freed to live with purpose. He wrote, "Do not act as if you were going to live 10,000 years. Death hangs over you. While you live, while it is in your power, be good." For Marcus, discipline was perspective, knowing that anger, fear, and greed are meaningless in the face of mortality. For us, remembering our mortality can sharpen our focus. It reminds us to live intentionally, to waste less time, to treat each day as valuable. So what can we learn from Marcus Aurelius about self-discipline? Create habits of reflection. Keep a journal. Write daily reminders to yourself, just as Marcus did. Master emotions. Expect challenges, but choose calm responses. Anger is weakness. Control is strength. Choose duty over comfort. Do what must be done, not what is easy. Live simply. Needing less makes you freer and stronger. Keep perspective. Remember death, and let it remind you of what really matters. Marcus Aurelius lived 2,000 years ago, but his lessons are timeless. He was not perfect, not unshakable, but he practiced self-discipline every day. And that is why his words still inspire. Marcus Aurelius was the most powerful man of his time. He commanded armies, ruled an empire, and carried the weight of millions of lives on his shoulders. Yet his true greatness was not in conquest or wealth, but in the quiet discipline with which he lived. Self-discipline is not chains. It is not punishment. It is the path to freedom. Freedom from fear, from desire, from anger, from distraction. It is the way to live with purpose. And as Marcus himself wrote, "Waste no more time arguing what a good man should be. Be one, this has been history for nap time." Thank you for listening. Welcome to History for Nap Time. Tonight, we'll explore something unusual, something about medieval life that might surprise you. Most people today think of sleep as one long stretch. You go to bed, you sleep for 7 or 8 hours, and you wake up. But in the Middle Ages, villagers didn't sleep this way. Instead, they slept in segments. They had what was called a first sleep and a second sleep, with a waking period in between. During this time, people prayed, talked, worked quietly, even visited neighbors. It might sound strange, but in fact, it was perfectly normal for centuries. In this episode, we'll step into the medieval village, into its houses and routines, to understand why people never slept straight through the night, and what they did instead. To understand medieval sleep, we need to first imagine daily life. Most villagers lived in small wooden or stone houses. often with thatched roofs. A single room might serve as kitchen, bedroom, and living space for the whole family. A fire burned in the hearth, not only for cooking, but to keep away the cold. Workdays were long and physical. People rose with the sun, worked in the fields, tended animals, and did household tasks from dawn to dusk. Light came from candles, rushlights, or the fire, dim compared to our electric bulbs. When night fell, the village grew dark and quiet. Darkness itself shaped how people thought of time and sleep. Without clocks, their rhythms followed nature, sunrise, sunset, and the moon. Sleep wasn't about counting 8 hours. It was about resting when the body and the sky told you to. Historians have found countless references to the medieval pattern of segmented sleep. People would go to bed soon after nightfall, sleeping for perhaps 4 hours. This was their first sleep. Then they would wake, often around midnight, and stay awake for an hour or two. Afterward, they returned to bed for their second sleep, lasting until dawn. This wasn't rare, it was the norm. We know it from diaries, court records, even literature. In Geoffrey Chaucer's works, characters mention first sleep. In 15th century medical texts, physicians recommended what to do between sleeps. The Bible itself contains passages suggesting nighttime waking for prayer. In this waking period, people did many things. Some prayed, believing the hours after midnight were sacred. Others talked quietly with family, told stories, or tended the fire. Farmers sometimes went outside to check on animals. Couples used the time for intimacy. It was a flexible, accepted rhythm of life, one that seems strange only because we have forgotten it. There were many reasons medieval villagers didn't sleep in one long block. First, light and darkness. With no artificial lighting, evenings were short. People often went to bed earlier than we do today. Going to bed soon after sunset meant they naturally woke in the middle of the night. Second, the body's natural rhythm. Modern science shows that when people live without artificial light, they often fall into this segmented sleep pattern. The brain releases melatonin earlier, people wake naturally after a few hours, and then return to sleep. Third, safety and fire. In a world lit by open flames, someone needed to check the hearth, add fuel, or make sure sparks didn't catch. Night waking had a practical purpose. And finally, culture and religion. Night was not simply for sleep. It was a time for prayer, reflection, and quiet tasks. Medieval people believed the midnight hours were a time when the soul was especially close to God. What happened during that midnight interval? It depended on the household. Some people prayed. Manuals of devotion even included special prayers after your first sleep. Priests and monks often scheduled night offices, midnight services, aligning with this natural waking. Others did small chores. A woman might mend clothing by firelight. A man might sharpen tools. Couples often used the time for intimacy. Doctors of the era even recommended it, saying conception was more likely after first sleep, when the body was rested but not yet sluggish. Neighbors sometimes visited one another, especially in winter, when nights were long. Imagine walking through a quiet village, lantern in hand, knocking at a friend's door, not because of an emergency, but simply because it was the natural time to talk. Children, too, were awake. Parents told them stories, shared dreams, or calmed fears. So the night was not silent. It was filled with a softer rhythm, one of prayer, whispers, fire crackling, and footsteps in the dark. This pattern of first and second sleep isn't guesswork. Historians like Roger E. Kirch have documented hundreds of references. In court records from the Middle Ages, Witnesses speak of crimes happening after the first sleep. In medical texts, physicians give advice on what to do between sleeps. In diaries, people casually mention their first sleep, as if it were ordinary. Even great literature remembers it. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, in French poems, and in sermons, first sleep appears as a common phrase. What's striking is that people didn't feel the need to explain it. It was so normal they assumed everyone understood. For medieval villagers, night was not just darkness. It was a spiritual time. The hours after midnight were believed to be sacred. Monks rose to sing night prayers, believing the soul was closer to heaven in those still hours. Lay people imitated this with private prayers. But there were also fears. Night was thought to be the time when witches and spirits were strongest. Dreams were seen as messages, sometimes from God, sometimes from the devil. Waking in the night gave people a chance to reflect, to ward off evil with prayer, or to interpret their visions. So segmented sleep was not just practical. It was woven into the fabric of belief. Not everyone experienced the night the same way. Wealthier households, with more candles and servants, could afford to stay awake later. They might push their bedtime closer to midnight and shorten the waking interval. But for most villagers, with little light beyond the fire, early bedtime and segmented sleep were standard. In noble households, the midnight waking might include reading, discussion, or even feasting. In peasant cottages, it was quieter, mending tools, sharing stories, or simply tending the animals. The rhythm, however, was shared. Across classes, first and second sleep were part of daily life. Why did this pattern fade away? The answer lies in the rise of artificial light. In the 17th and 18th centuries, as candles became cheaper and oil lamps improved, people began staying awake later. Coffee houses opened, cities lit their streets, and people pushed bedtime closer to midnight. With a later bedtime, there was no longer a natural waking in the middle of the night. Sleep compressed into one block. By the Industrial Revolution, segmented sleep was forgotten, replaced by the expectation of an unbroken 8 hours. Today, when people struggle with insomnia or wake in the middle of the night, they often think something is wrong. In truth, their bodies may be echoing an older rhythm, the same rhythm that guided medieval villagers for centuries. Modern experiments support this. When volunteers live without artificial light, their sleep often divides into 2 segments, with a calm waking in between. They report feeling peaceful, reflective, not anxious. In a way, medieval villagers were simply following nature. Their segmented sleep was not a disorder, but a healthy rhythm shaped by light, darkness, and culture. Perhaps our ancestors were closer to the natural flow of time than we are today. So why did medieval villagers never sleep straight through the night? Because their world was darker, quieter, and more in tune with the sun and moon. Because their bodies followed rhythms we have forgotten. Because night was not only for sleep, but for prayer, intimacy, and quiet work. First sleep and second sleep were part of their lives, as ordinary as breakfast or bedtime stories. Today, when we wake in the night, we might see it as a problem, but in the Middle Ages, it was simply life. Thank you for joining me in this exploration of medieval sleep. This has been History for Nap Time. May your own sleep tonight, whether in 1 block or 2, be calm and restful. Welcome to History for Nap Time. When you think of Sparta, you probably imagine warriors, bronze armor, shields, endless drills, and harsh discipline. Movies and legends have told us that Spartans were raised only for war, stripped of comfort, trained from birth, and turned into soldiers who knew nothing but battle. But the reality was more nuanced. Yes, Spartans valued strength and discipline, but their training went beyond combat. It shaped the entire citizen, body and mind. It included endurance, athletics, music, education, and ritual. Women, too, were part of this system, something rare in the ancient world. Tonight, let's look past the myths and discover what Spartan training was really like, and why it produced not just warriors, but a society that fascinated and frightened the ancient world. To understand Spartan training, we must first understand Spartan society. Sparta was unlike other Greek city-states. Its citizens, the Spartiates, lived as a military elite. Beneath them were the Helots, an enslaved population that farmed the land. Around them lived the Perioikoi, free non-citizens who handled trade and crafts. The Spartan system depended on controlling this structure, and that required discipline. Every Spartiate male was expected to be ready for war, not because Sparta was always at war with outsiders, but because it feared uprisings from within. Training was not just about fighting Persians or rival Greeks. It was about maintaining control, unity, and order. The Spartan ideal was not the strongest individual, but the most disciplined community. Popular culture paints a brutal picture. Newborns inspected, weak children discarded, boys whipped, girls neglected. While there is truth to some of these accounts, much of it has been exaggerated by later writers, especially rivals who wanted to portray Sparta as both admirable and terrifying. Spartan infants were indeed examined. Those judged unfit were said to be abandoned. But whether this was common practice or more of a symbolic law is debated by historians. Most evidence suggests Sparta, like other societies, valued children and families. The reality is that Spartan boys entered the agoge, the state-run training system, at age 7. And it was this system, not infanticide or cruelty, that shaped them into the citizens Sparta needed. The agoge was Sparta's educational system for boys. It was compulsory for male citizens and designed to last from age 7 until adulthood. At first, boys learned through games and exercises, running, jumping, wrestling. As they grew, the training became harsher. Living in groups, wearing minimal clothing, eating modest rations. The purpose wasn't to starve them, but to teach endurance and resourcefulness. Stealing food, for instance, was encouraged as a test of cunning, but being caught was punished to teach discipline. Physical training emphasized not only strength, but agility and stamina. Boys learned to fight in formation, to march barefoot, to endure heat and cold. They were whipped, not for cruelty, but as a ritual of toughness. But the agoge also included intellectual training. Boys learned songs, poetry, and how to speak briefly and sharply, the origin of the laconic style. They learned obedience, loyalty, and respect for elders. The goal was not to create individual champions, but to form men who would fight as one unit, who would obey without hesitation, and who would put the city before themselves. One of the most remarkable aspects of Spartan training was that girls, too, were expected to be physically strong. While in most Greek cities women lived indoors, weaving and raising children, Spartan girls ran, wrestled, and threw javelins. They exercised in public, sometimes even unclothed, shocking other Greeks. Why? The Spartans believed strong women produced strong children. Mothers were expected to encourage their sons to be brave, even to prefer death in battle over dishonor. To do this, they themselves had to be resilient. Spartan women were not soldiers, but they were partners in the Spartan system. Their training made them unique in the Greek world, admired by some, criticized by others. The essence of Spartan training was not just strength, but discipline, endurance, and a sense of belonging to the community above all else. Spartans were taught from a young age that comfort was dangerous. Boys were given only one cloak for the year, forced to endure heat, cold, and rain. They slept on beds of reeds, which they had to cut themselves without tools. These lessons weren't about cruelty, but about resilience. One famous ritual was the whipping contest at the sanctuary of Artemis Orthia. Young boys were flogged in front of crowds, not as punishment, but as a test of how much pain they could bear without crying out. Surviving this ordeal was a badge of honor, but endurance was also social. Spartans didn't eat with their families but in common mess halls called syssitia. Here, men shared simple meals, black broth, barley bread, figs, and wine. No matter how rich or poor, every Spartan citizen ate the same food and lived the same life. Meals weren't only about eating. They were about building trust, forging unity, and reinforcing that Spartans lived not for themselves, but for their city. This communal spirit was the heart of Spartan discipline. Each man was only as strong as his brothers in the phalanx. Although Sparta is remembered as a purely militaristic society, training extended beyond war. Spartans valued athletics, ritual, and even music as essential to discipline and strength. Festivals like the Gymnopaidia, Festival of the Naked Youths, showcased young men performing dances, exercises, and choral songs before the community. These events weren't entertainment. They were displays of rhythm, coordination, and unity. Spartans also competed in the Olympics and Pan-Hellenic Games. Wrestling, running, and discus were part of their training. Winning brought honor not to the individual alone, but to Sparta as a whole. Music, too, was important. Boys learned choral songs that praised bravery and mocked cowardice. When Spartans marched to war, they sang to the rhythm of flutes, keeping the phalanx steady. This use of discipline through culture set them apart from other Greeks, who valued personal glory more than group cohesion. Training, then, was not endless drills, but a blend of exercise, ritual, and cultural bonding. Sparta was not joyless. It was carefully ordered, with even joy structured to serve the state. To see what made Spartan training unique, we need to compare it with other city-states. In Athens, boys trained in gymnasia, learning athletics, but also philosophy, rhetoric, and the arts. The goal was arete, individual excellence. Athenian citizens were expected to be strong, but also persuasive and cultured. In Sparta, training was collective. The agauge crushed individuality for the sake of unity. While Athenians admired clever speakers, Spartans admired men who spoke briefly and acted decisively. Other Greeks also thought Spartan women were shocking. In Athens, women rarely left the house. In Sparta, they trained in athletics, sang in choruses, and managed estates while men were at war. To Athenians, this was indecent. To Spartans, it was essential. These contrasts show that Spartan training wasn't just about producing warriors. It was about producing a different kind of citizen, one who embodied loyalty, equality, and silence in the face of hardship. If Athens built philosophers, Sparta built a brotherhood of endurance. Much of what we think we know about Sparta comes from outsiders. Writers like Plutarch, centuries later, admired their toughness, but also exaggerated their cruelty. The image of weak babies thrown into a chasm likely comes from later Roman retellings, not daily Spartan practice. More likely, elders judged whether a child was healthy, but abandonment was rare. The myth of constant war training also simplifies reality. Spartans did farm, hunt, sing, and compete. They lived full lives, though harsher than most Greeks. Modern films, especially 300, have turned Spartans into superhuman warriors, stripping away their flaws and humanity. In truth, Spartans depended heavily on the Helots, lived under constant fear of revolt, and struggled with population decline. Their training system was powerful, but it came at great cost. Understanding these realities helps us see Spartans not as comic book heroes, but as humans shaped by a society unlike any other in Greece. So what was Spartan training beyond the myths? It was a system designed to shape not only the body, but the soul. It built endurance, loyalty, and unity. It included men and women, rich and poor, every citizen bound by shared discipline. It was not the cartoon of endless cruelty, nor the fantasy of perfect warriors. It was a way of life, created for a specific society, for a specific purpose: survival. And though the Spartan system eventually declined, its legend endures. Not because it was perfect, but because it was unforgettable. This has been History for Nap Time. Thank you for joining me, and may your own path to strength, whether physical or mental, be calmer than that of the Spartans.